It was the grand finale of the Skilling Open. Magnus Carlsen against Wesley So. Day 1, honours were even. They went into day 2. Magnus Carlsen won the first rapid play game. Wesley So won the second. Then in game 3, oh my goodness, what a rollercoaster ride. Both players missed good chances. That ended in a draw. And then Magnus Carlsen, with the white pieces in the fourth rapid play game, just steered the game very quickly towards a draw. Incredible. He repeated his strategy from the World Championship matches of 2016 and 2018 and headed straight for the tie breaks. Well, was that a lack of confidence? I mean, both players were making errors throughout these rapid play games. It looked like the nerves were getting to them. Anyway, here is the first of the rapid play tiebreak blitz games. So 5 minutes on the clock each, and then 3 seconds added per move. Wesley So with the white pieces. It's Caro-Kann, advance from Wesley. So this is one of the most ambitious lines that white can play, gaining space. And knight f3, Wesley plays the so-called short variation, named after Nigel Short, who developed this line with knight f3 and bishop e2. Looks quite modest, actually. White can decide later on whether to play on the king side or play on the queen side, and it is a very ambitious setup. And often this bishop, which, well, you might think is well placed outside the pawn chain compared to a French defense, for example, well, sometimes that piece just gets in the way. It's interesting. But this system for white certainly has a very good reputation. Interesting that Carlsen plays this Caro with black. I think he's trying to wind up Wesley somehow. And here, well, in fact, the players have played exactly this position before, and Wesley played knight d2 earlier in the year, actually. But we had a4, and I rather like this. Very often, black wants to get counterplay on the queen side with c5, as in the French defense, but this gains space. That can be quite nice. So knight d7, a5 is quite well known, and this can be a bit troublesome for black. So Carlsen played a5, just blocking that a pawn, but this also has consequences, because if black ever goes for c5, then the b5 square can be a bit weaker. So time for some development. Knight d2, knight d7, knight b3. Bishop drop back to h7. Sometimes that can be hit with knight h4, so it's a preemptive move. Bishop d2, good move. So there's starting to be a little bit of pressure on this pawn. Here Carlsen plays queen b6. Don't know if that's absolutely necessary, but perhaps he was still gunning for c5. h3, there's a careful move from Wesley. Sometimes it can be nice to actually advance with g4 if a knight comes here and that supports it. Sometimes it might be nice to drop the bishop back to h2 and then advance the kingside pawns. Anyway, it's kind of a waiting move, actually. And now knight g6 from Carlsen. Another way to play is g5 here, but, well, who knows? That's maybe just a bit too loose for Magnus. Anyway, he played knight g6. And now an excellent move from Wesley. Queen e1. The queen, bishop and knight hit that a pawn, and that is already rather uncomfortable for black to meet. Bishop b4 played by Carlsen. Bishop takes. Now if pawn takes, then a5, and after the queen goes backwards, then queen takes b4. So queen takes b4. Wesley exchanged queens and then played bishop d3 because knight f4 is perhaps unpleasant. So bishop d3 played. And here, if Carlsen makes a normal move, let's say Carlsen's kingside, then a5 is rather uncomfortable with this idea. And if b6, well, you can see that white has a really nice positional advantage with that knight on c5. So here Magnus thought for, well, it says 48 seconds, which in a blitz game is a long time, but I think it's understandable because this is already quite difficult. He played c5, so he wants to undermine the support for the e-pawn. And now here already bishop b5 is a very strong move, but, well, Wesley took on c5 with the knight. Knight takes, pawn takes. This is also very promising for white. Rook a5. Magnus, of course, would very much like to recapture that pawn, but bishop b5 check. King e7. So at the moment, white is a pawn up. Rook e1 guards the e-pawn. Rook c8. Magnus still wants to recapture the pawn. And here, well, Wesley plays a really tempting move. He plays c3. He could also play knight d4, which looks incredibly strong. Because if rook takes, thank you very much, that's a nasty knight fork. Black would have to give up the exchange here, but white is obviously better. Instead, Wesley went for c3. It's also very strong. If b3, then knight d4, and that's even better than the last variation. So Magnus took, and then, of course, Wesley did not recapture. Instead, b4, and joined up those pawns. Wow. They look very impressive. And here, well, white has a number of good moves. Knight d4 is good. Wesley played very simply. He just collected that c-pawn. Now c2 is quite tricky, but white should still be better there as well. Knight f4 played. So Magnus is trying to get some counterplay on the king side to distract white from advancing this wonderful pawn front on the queen side. a5, here we go, f6, counterplay in the middle of the board. Here, the move I like is bishop f1. Just keeps everything absolutely secure. Maybe later on the b pawn can be pushed, but really after bishop f1, then we're ready to push that knight away, having secured the h pawn. But h4 from Wesley, so he's intending playing g3 in another way. g5, it's getting a bit rocky. Magnus doing his best to try to complicate the position. g3, the knight goes back to g6. So e5 is under fire, pawn takes pawn check, king takes pawn, and now pawns exchanged on g5. So let's just do a quick material count. White is still a pawn up, and this should be a win. And there's a very powerful move here. Rook e3, doubling, potentially with the idea of playing knight d2 and forcing the bishop out of the way. Sometimes after this, after rook e3, it's possible simply to sack an exchange to get a huge advantage. But knight h2 played instead, and now Magnus starts to come back into the game. Knight e5. Rook e3. Rook h8. This is starting to look interesting. Threats on the h-file. Now, Wesley makes a blunder. He plays pawn to f3. Could have played g4. Looks slightly strange, but the point is this. After rook takes, knight g4, king here, knight takes, pawn takes, although material is now even, white still has the advantage there because that rook is going to check here, and force the king back. So, you know, these pawns still look very impressive. So that move g4, actually it's about giving the king some room on g3. But f3 played instead, and that allowed rook takes knight. And now Magnus is back in the game. Knight takes. Winning back the exchange. Now pawns are even. c6. Well, it was interesting that actually Magnus was running really short of time. Very often it's the other way round. You find Magnus's opponents who go right down to the wire. So this was rather different. Wesley was playing pretty steadily, quite evenly actually. And here, well, Magnus returns the favour. He makes a big mistake. He could take on c6 and play rook a7. So it's still not possible to advance these pawns further. And there is counterplay with rook h7 check. And that should be good enough for a draw. But instead, Magnus played d4. It's a really tempting move because it opens up the bishop's diagonal here. So the bishop covers the pawn on b7, but also starts to roll that d pawn, and you know it could be supported by the e pawn next. So Magnus is playing so ambitiously, and so often this gets him points. Well, let's see what happened here. There is a strong move for white. Wesley found it. Rook f1. Incredible. Pin and win. So if g4 holding the bishop, then it's simply possible to take and take on b7, and one of those is going to roll through. Wow, an absolute shocker. So after rook f1, rook h8 check, king g1, rook h1. It's the only way to keep going for a moment, but this is still lost. So what are the options? Well, Magnus took on f1. If bishop takes c6, we can take, and the pawn endgame is completely winning for white. The pawn rolls through to the queening square. Let's go back. So after king f2, rook takes rook check. Bishop takes rook. The king threatens the bishop, so bishop takes pawn. And this is winning for white. b5. White creates a passed pawn. Didn't matter where the bishop went, because if the bishop comes back to c6, then bishop g2 is going to win. Just exchanging off the bishop, and then the pawn rolls home. There is absolutely no defense there. So, well, a forlorn hope from Magnus. It really is hopeless. And bishop f1. There we go. A simple winning move. There is absolutely no defense. If king here, then bishop g2 exchanges off the bishops, and the pawn queens. So Wesley won the first of the Blitz games. And I have to say his play was just far more even than Magnus's. You can point at a couple of mistakes, but no real blunders there. Whereas Magnus, he never really got his mojo working in that game. Second Blitz game. Let's have a very quick look at that one. So Magnus Carlsen with the white pieces. Remember, he's in a must-win situation. Wesley knows his openings so well. He's highly responsible, and he goes in for this. So we've transposed into a Queen's Gambit accepted. And Carlsen goes for a pretty quiet line. He exchanges on c5, going right into an endgame? Well, he has shown a liking for this way of playing the position. In fact, they've actually done battle from this position before. And previously, this is a game in 2017, Wesley dropped the bishop back to b6, but Carlsen managed to squeeze out a win. But Wesley was ready. Ready with an improvement. He played knight d7. So you could say this is a compromise. But really, even if white takes the bishops, well, black has enough activity there to compensate. I mean, Wesley has obviously studied this. In fact, Magnus took the other bishop, knight a5. Rook b8. And there we go. So Carlsen has a theoretical advantage here in the two bishops. But they're not beautifully placed. I think obviously the bishop on e2 has more promise, can perhaps come to f3, but also it's looking at those pawns and, you know, maybe a4. This one at the moment really isn't in the game. And black's pieces are well coordinated. So rook d1, rook c8 and bishop e1. So a typical little curl up. This bishop for the moment just hangs back, and you never know, later on it might be able to come out here. Now, Wesley's next move was a shocker. In this quiet position, he allowed the position to blow up in his face. Could play g5. That's an interesting move, just to gain space on the king side. Could drop the king back as well. But he played bishop d6. And that allowed a tactic. So Magnus was back in the game. Pawn takes, knight takes. The rook is threatened and the bishop. So rook c6 at least holds this one. And knight a7. So Magnus is going to win one of these rooks. And then we have an interesting situation where we have rook and two pawns against two minor pieces, two knights. Bishop e5. But here, well, Magnus was unusually hesitant. He thought for almost a minute here. The thing is, there's actually no need to take one of these rooks yet. So they're not running away. So you could play rook b1 here and then take a rook and push. Or rook a b1. Also possible. But Magnus took straight away, and I find that a strange decision. And now it really is not so clear. So first things first. Bishop takes pawn threatened. Rook b1. Of course, white needs to get these queenside pawns going to take the initiative. But watch what happens. Rook a8. Threatening the pawn, so a3. Now knight d5. In fact, knight d5 isn't necessary here. But, you know, black could go for counterplay straight away with g5, gain some space on the king side. Knight d5, and Magnus missed a good move here. He could play e4 and just push that knight back and play f3. And that really is to white's benefit. And if knight f4, then g3, the knight has to go back. This is a better position for white. That would turn things in white's favour. But Carlsen curiously played rook c1, unusually hesitant. And after f5, everything was okay with black's position again. This is very nice. Once the knight is secured on d5, the f-pawn prevents e4, then, I mean, this is such a beautiful piece. Controlling key squares. Well, all over the board, actually. Beautiful piece. And now it's hard work for white. h3. Notice It's impossible to push these pawns. If b4, then this one drops. a4, well, that obviously drops to rook takes. So this is not an easy position for white. g5, excellent move from Wesley, gaining counterplay on the king side. So if he can keep Magnus distracted, he'll never be able to push those pawns. Rook c2, this is pretty tortuous stuff. g4, starting to open lines. Knight f6, yeah, the next knight wants to come in and find some squares perhaps. Rook a1, it's pretty slow, it's painfully slow. a4, excuse me, f4, and now Carlsen should at least try a4, although I'm sure that black has enough counterplay here by opening lines and perhaps counterattacking with the rook. But Carlsen, well, he was under pressure. He was short of time again, and he took on g4. It's a mistake. Instead of recapturing, Wesley took on e3. Good move. Excellent move. Because this gives black's pieces squares, and there's counterplay straight away. That pawn is threatened. Bishop check, king d6. The king is actually quite safe in the middle. And knight e3. And, well, really white has to be incredibly careful in this position, with these minor pieces sort of buzzing around the king and the rooks as well. Rook c1. Knight takes g2. Good move. Attacking the bishop, but also that knight might spin back to f4. There it goes. Knight f4 check. And here, well, it's quite clear that black is absolutely fine. I think it's possible for black to play for a win, but actually Wesley just took it very easily. Remember, he only needed a draw. So, for example, here he could play knight takes pawn, but he just basically exchanged everything off. And considering that a draw would bring him the title, there was no need to actually risk anything. And after this, well, Magnus just exchanged. And that was the end of that. A draw, and with it, Wesley So wins the title of the Skilling Open, the first in the Play Magnus series of online tournaments. It'll stretch right through into next September. It was a fully deserved victory from Wesley So. I have to say that in this final, Magnus looked uncharacteristically hesitant. He wasn't playing as fast as usual. He wasn't decisive in his with his decisions. And Wesley, on the whole, played more evenly than the world champion. So well done to Wesley So. Excellent victory. Tough for Magnus. It was his 30th birthday and not exactly the result he wanted. But there you go. He can't win them all. Thanks for watching.